This morning, it struck me when we were reciting this series of prayers, the feeling that at this moment that we are living in, it's really necessary to recite all of those prayers. It's necessary to recite prayers for peace, because as a people, we always pray for peace. All of our services end in a prayer for peace. The Amidah ends in Sim Shalom. The Chatzi Kaddish, or the full Kaddish rather, ends with Oseh Shalom. Peace is really one of the fundamental elements of what we pray for. And the word shalom is not just peace as in peace between nations, a lack of war, but also peace in terms of our own internal well-being. From shalom, or from shalem, meaning shlemut, meaning well-being or wholeness. So we pray for peace. That's natural and normal, and something that we do on any given day. At this moment, we also pray for the return of the hostages, whose well-being continues to be on our minds. And we pray for the IDF, because not because we're warmongers or we're interested in war, but because we understand that the people that serve in the IDF are not only our brethren, but they are literally the children of people that we know. And in many cases in this congregation, they are our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And one of the things about being at Beth Tzedec and being in Canada is that we have multiple personal relationships with people in Israel, and they're in uniform. And so by praying for the IDF, we're also praying for our own kids, for their safety and for their ability to be triumphant during this period of conflict and of difficulty. And so this tension of holding both peace and war at the same time is on my mind as I approached the Torah reading. And as I did so, I found towards the beginning of the Torah reading this verse. Kumu su'u v'avru et nachal Arnon. This is from Devarim chapter 2, verse 24. Get up, set across the Wadi Arnon. Re'eh natati biyadcha et Sichon melech Heshbon ha'amori. Behold, I have given into your power Sichon, the Amorite, the king of Heshbon, v'artzo, and his land. Hachel rash v'hitgar bo milchama. Begin the occupation of his land, engage him in battle, go to war. God tells Bnei Yisrael that they are to have the land of Sichon, the land which belongs to Sichon, the king of Heshbon, and they are to take that land through war. They're to make war. Now, a couple verses later, listen to what Moshe does. Ve'eshlach melachim mimidbar kedei mot el Sichon melech Heshbon. Then I, Moshe, sent messengers into the wilderness of Kedemot to the king Sichon of Heshbon. Divrei shalom lemor. Divrei shalom lemor, with words of peace. Ebra v'artzecha baderech elech, let me pass through your country, and I will keep strictly to the highways. Lo asur yamin usmol, and I won't turn to the left or to the right. In other words, I'll stay on the 401, right? I just want to travel through. If you allow us to do that, we'll leave you alone, you'll leave us alone, we'll get to where we need to be, and all will be fine in the world. Now, Abravamel, Sichon does not respond in kind. Instead, he chooses to fight. He chooses to go to battle. and Israel ultimately, according to the Torah, is victorious. Now, Don Isaac Abravanel, who was a Torah commentator, born in Libsyn in 1437 and died in Venice in 1508, and to know where he was born and where he died is important in this case, he sees a problem with what Moshe does. What's the problem? Doesn't listen to God. God's command is go to war. Here I'm giving you all this, go to war. Moshe doesn't listen. Moshe instead sends messengers and makes an offer of peace. And so Abravanel and others are completely taken aback by this. How could he do this? How could he do this? Does God's command not mean anything? Why would Moshe do such a thing? And Abravanel suggests that Moses' offer of peace was a formality, that both God and Moshe knew that Sichon would reject it, but nevertheless, they wanted to offer it for the off chance that perhaps, maybe, possibly, God willing, Sichon would take a different stance and would accept the offer. And that's, according to Abravanel, he posits that both Moshe and God knew the answer, but yet they were still obligated to pursue peace. Now, this comment from Abravanel is not surprising. Abravanel was an advisor to the kings of both Portugal and Spain. He was a diplomat. And ironically, that didn't stop what from happening to him. Remember, he was born in Libsyn in 1437, and he died in Venice in 1508. So what happened to Don Isaac Abravanel? He was expelled with the rest of Spanish and Portuguese Jewry with the Spanish Inquisition of 1492. Right? So even though he was a diplomat, even though he was an advisor to the kings, when it came time for the Jews to leave, he was forced to leave with the rest of them. That's how he ended up in Venice. And that's a sermon for another day. Midrash Tanchuma, on the first encounter that we have with this section of the Torah in Parshat Chukat, offers an insight on this process of going beyond God's command in the pursuit of peace. It quotes similar texts from Numbers. Then Israel sent messengers to Sichon. And then it says that this text is related to a teaching from Psalms, chapter 34, verse 15, that says, "Depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it." On the text from Psalms, Midrash Tanchuma says the following: if these situations, and it presents a series of situations, if these situations present themselves to you, you are given a command concerning them, but you are not commanded to pursue them. In the case of peace, however, seek peace wherever you are and pursue it wherever else it may be, meaning that there are a series of commandments, of mitzvot, that if the opportunity arises to perform them, you should perform them. But when it comes to peace, peace is something you have to pursue. It's not a mitzvah of circumstance. It's a mitzvah of action, of chase. Right? Now, what are some of the mitzvot that we only perform when circumstances arise to do so? The most famous is later in Deuteronomy. Ki yikareh ken tzipor lefanecha. When you're walking through the forest and you're hungry and you come upon a bird's nest and you see in that bird's nest are eggs and you want to have scrambled eggs for breakfast, you have to first shoo the mother bird away before you take the eggs. Right? It's totally a mitzvah of circumstance. You have to be in the forest. You have to be hungry. You have to come across a bird's nest that you can reach without a ladder that has eggs in it, and the mother has to be on the bird's nest in order to perform that mitzvah. Right? Probably not a mitzvah that gets performed very often, certainly not in our day. mean, I go to the supermarket for eggs. I don't know about you. And then the Midrash gives a series of other examples. Ki tir'eh, ki tivsor. When you see the donkey of your enemy and that donkey is overburdened and is suffering, even though he's your enemy, you have to stop to help the donkey. Ki tivsor, when you're harvesting and your sheaves fall, you have to leave your sheaves for the poor. The general rule, according to Midrash Tanchuma, kulam im ba'o liyadcha, if these mitzvot come to your hand, ata mitzuveh aleha, if the opportunity comes to fulfill it, you do so. V'lo lirdof acharecha, and you're not commanded to run after it. V'hashalom, but for peace, bikesh shalom bimkomcha, but peace is not left to chance. V'radfehu b'makom acher, you have to chase after peace. And then the Mishnah quotes our verse from Deuteronomy as its proof text. The meaning of the Midrash is clear. As Abravanel commented, in the pursuit of peace, not only may you go beyond the command of God, but you must go beyond the command of God. Now, it's interesting to consider these texts during a time of war. How does one reconcile the pursuit of peace with the necessity to fight a just war? Political philosophers have been commenting on this for centuries. John Stuart Mill, perhaps one of the most well-known and famous of political commentators, wrote that war is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things, meaning that he believed that war, though undesirable, could be necessary to prevent even worse outcomes, such as tyranny or the erosion of liberty. For Mill, the use of war to defend freedom and establish a just order is morally justifiable and could lead to a more lasting peace. More modern, David Petraeus, former U.S. Army general and CIA director responsible when he was in Iraq, has become a leading voice in counterinsurgency strategies. He argues that winning the hearts and minds of the local population is crucial to achieving lasting peace, suggesting that military might alone is insufficient without accompanying efforts to rebuild and stabilize war-torn regions, which is why the conversation about what the plan is on the day after the war in Gaza is so important. War might create the opportunity for peace, but without a plan for how you rebuild and renew and acknowledge the human dignity and aspirations of the local population, that peace will not be lasting. Right? So there's this notion, and it's not a new notion, that war, when necessary and fought justly and with a plan afterwards, could lead to a lasting peace. Of course, our Jewish sources speak of this as well. Kohelet very famously says that there is a time for love, a time to hate, a time for milchama, for war, and a time for shalom, for peace, acknowledging the existence of both war and peace as part of our human experience, suggesting that there are appropriate times for each, depending upon the circumstances, and reflecting a nuanced understanding of the balance between conflict and harmony. Maimonides, in Mishnah Torah, in a section of halakha, of Jewish law, about the laws of kings and wars, Maimonides teaches that war is not a goal, but a means to achieve a goal. The purpose of war is to create conditions under which the nation of Israel can live according to the Torah and to the commandments. And in the case of fighting Hamas in Gaza, quite frankly, to also just be able to live. As Elie Wiesel famously said, the first human right is the right to life. If you can't live, you can't do everything else. And so what Maimonides, who meant from this, and he was 10th, 11th century, a medieval Jewish philosopher, he discusses the conditions under which war is permissible, particularly distinguishing between milchemet mitzvah, a mandatory war, such as a war of self-defense, which we find Israel fighting at this moment, and milchemet reshut, a discretionary war. And he emphasizes that war is not an end in itself, but a means to achieve a higher purpose. Sounds a lot like David Petraeus, doesn't it? Namely, the ability to live a life of religious observance and shalom, of peace. In other words, sometimes war is necessary in the pursuit of peace. At this moment, I know for myself and for many of us, I'm checking the news every day, sometimes several hours, several times a day, waiting for the other shoe to drop. What is going to be Hezbollah's response and retaliation? What is going to be Iran's response and retaliation? When is my daughter and my friends and so many others going to have to go into a bomb shelter? And how many days are they going to have to stay there? And yet, at the same time, we read yesterday that Israel is sending negotiators to hopefully finalize a potential peace agreement. We know that Israelis, most Israelis, according to polls, somewhere between 70 and 90% of Israelis are prepared to end the war in Gaza in exchange for the release of all the hostages. And though it hasn't been publicized, I know from my recent trip to Israel and learning, Israel does have a detailed plan for the day after the war. But Israel knows that if it presents it, the moment it presents it, it's dead in the water because Israel is presenting it. And so there's a diplomatic dance that has to happen in which Israel needs to be pressured, mostly by the US, in order to do the plan that it has already written. It's not satisfying, and it's really frustrating as a Western liberal person who looks at the world and just wants people to tell the truth and be straight with you, right? But that, unfortunately, is not the way in which the world works, especially in that part of the world. But there is a detailed plan for the day after. And I learned with the guy who wrote it. And so it exists. You should know it's not going to necessarily be the type of plan that we imagine and that the movies sometimes show after the rain stops and the war ends and the sun comes out. It's going to be tribes, Palestinian tribes in Gaza that are going to have guns and are going to, use those guns. But they won't be pointing their guns at Israel. And that's the difference. And it's a messy, complicated circumstance. But it exists because Israel has always, since its existence, put out an olive branch for the opportunity for peace, sent messengers to achieve peace, but also made sure that the IDF has the tools that it needs in order to defend the nation from harm. And so this morning's Torah reading, and this idea that God had a command that Moshe went beyond in the pursuit of peace is a reminder to us that we live in a moment, and that in reality we always live in this moment, where we hold both truths at the same time. As Kohelet said, there's a time for war and there's a time for peace. And when the time for war comes, if it's fought justly, if it achieves the aims that it sets out to achieve, and if those fighting it and others in the international community create the context for lasting peace, there's a possibility that war can lead to shalom, and God willing, it will. Last comment. Israel ultimately at the end of this, as my mother used to say to me all the time, the only person you can control is yourself. Israel at the end of this, the only country Israel can actually control is itself. And Israel is already beginning to ask the significant questions as that when this is all over and done with, what's the type of country we want to be? How does this war create an opportunity for us as Israelis to achieve the ability to live, as Maimonides said, towards a higher purpose of Torah and mitzvot and shalom. Shabbat shalom.